So your new book, Old High German Poetry, an Anthology, just recently came out. If you were talking to someone who didn't really know that much about historical linguistics or medieval languages, how would you define to them Old High German?
Well, that's an interesting one, and I can probably start with a little anecdote about that. Uh, with the person to whom I dedicated the book, I dedicated it to a German friend of mine who I've known for very many years, whose career did not involve philology. And when he looked at it, he said, "Is this really German?" And Old High German is very unfamiliar at first glance. What it is the earliest written stage of the modern German language. It's written down from about, well, the end of the 8th century till about the middle of the 11th. And after that, it starts changing again. The language starts changing again and becomes a much more recognizable medieval Middle High German language. Give it another 500 years and we're up to Luther and we come on to the modern language eventually. But it does look very odd. And it's odd looking because it has lots of rather full vowels. Let me give you a brief example. The modern word Glaube, meaning belief,
Mhm.
in Old High German would be Galauba or Gelauba. And this is why my good friend Hans looked at it and said, "Is this really German?" Okay, I've misled you so far because I've been talking about Old High German. There is no such thing as Old High German. It is a collection of dialects, all of which are fairly radically different in some ways. That is, they all share a number of linguistic features, obviously, all the ones that distinguish the language from Low German, Anglo-Saxon, Old Saxon, and their modern equivalents. But it is a collection of dialects which vary quite a bit within themselves, so that my little example, Galauba, could very well appear as Kilauba or Kilaupa. And again, looking at that with a knowledge of modern German, you would think, I've no idea what that is. So that is the definition, if you like, of Old High German. It's a collection of dialects, the first stuff written down in German, and it was written down, what's more, by the church. And we have to remember this. It was written down by the monks, and therefore they did it using the equipment, if you like, of the language they knew best, which was Latin. So they used the Latin alphabet. And there are some sounds in Old High German which you can't do in Latin. TH, the, or th were very tricky, so you have to make something up. And people made up different things here and there. Sometimes they used separate letters. It would have been easier to use runic in some ways, but it was written down with the Latin alphabet. So there's Old High German for you. Uh, written down by the monks, the earliest stage, very varied and quite a lot different from the modern language.
Right. So you mentioned Glaube and Galauba. Like that was very interesting to me how many German words that begin with G are just corresponding with what in Old English we have the ye prefix. I had never realized that until reading, I think, one of the charms in your book when it says Gnade, Gnade, and that is modern German Gnade, Gnade, like mercy.
Yeah, yes.
But I had never realized that that G is just that y or g prefix that all these Germanic languages have. That's very interesting. So you mentioned Low German, then Old High German, and then I guess what we might call Old Saxon, then being the two sort of different dialects of modern day geographical Germany. Is that might be how you would describe that?
Yes, but remember that Low German, the modern ancestor, modern descendants, I beg your pardon, of Old Saxon, Plattdeutsch,
Hmm.
are quite different. They're a Low German language. Low and high it sounds very sort of moralizing. It's not. It just means the flat land and the higher ground. It's geographical. It's not moral. Um, so Anglo-Saxon, uh, yes, Old Saxon. Those two principally, the ancestors of the modern Low German languages, English and Plattdeutsch and Dutch as well. So they're rather different.
Right.
There is a
So,
little bit in the book. There isn't. Sorry, in the book there is a little bit of Old Saxon. There's a large gospel poem called the Heliant, which I've got an extract from in the work, just by way of
yeah,
example.
I think the Helion might be the most well-known Old Saxon text. Certainly the only one that I have really spent a lot of time with. Um, and then High German, I think people also will get confused because when you look at a map, you think high is the north and low is the south. But High German, then
Yeah,
that refers to sort of like Bavaria, right?
yeah. Yes, Bavaria is very High German, if you like, and it goes further down, right down to Italy, down to Lombardic, but we don't have any Lombardic, so well, we don't have very much
Right.
anyway, and no poetry.
Right. I was just speaking to Stephen Pollington recently, and we talked about the Lombardic Goldon being the sort of equivalent to Wodan in Old English and Old High German. Very, very interesting stuff.
There might have been a Lombardic version of the Hildebrandslied, but we don't know.
Yeah, that would have been
Constructed
really
it.
interesting to have. Yeah. Speaking of the Hildebrandslied, so the anthology begins on what I would call at least a very high note with the Hildebrandslied
Yeah.
and probably the most well-known Old High German work. However, I find that even amongst well-learned sort of Anglophone scholars, people just don't know much about the Hildebrandslied. They've either never read it or they simply, haven't even heard of it sometimes. Could you sort of give a background on what it is, what might be sort of going on here?
Well, the Hildebrandslied is a very impressive work, actually. Um, it's, as you probably know, deals with the quite well-known topos of the father having to fight the son in a battle. But this particular version of it is a very tightly expressed story, in which a father who is a great warrior is the representative of an army. So he's out there in the front and he has to fight the representative of the other army, who he discovers is his son. And the whole thing develops very briefly, very concisely, if you like, into a kind of existential tragedy where the father has to kill the son to prove who he is. And this is the real sense of the Hildebrandslied. The son knows his father was a great man and a great warrior, and assumes he must be dead. He also claims or says that he has no inheritance. He was left without inheritance. And inheritance is another theme of it. The older man says, well, if you kill me, you can take all my armor. That's your inheritance. Presumably part of the inheritance is the fact that the son is a great warrior as well, because he's representing his army. But he doesn't believe this man is his father. And the only way Hildebrand can prove it is by winning. And we don't have the end of the work. There's a little bit missing, not very much. But it's pretty certain that he does have to kill the son to make this point. And that's the, if you like, existential tragedy of it. It's a strange work in a way because, as I say, its conciseness and the way it presents this existential problem is beautifully done. The language is not even Old High German in a way. I said before that someone has tried to reconstruct a Lombardic version. The names look as if they might have been Lombardic. It might also have been Gothic before that. I don't know. No one knows. But what we have is essentially a High German, fairly high, Bavarian version perhaps, that someone has tried to translate into Low German and hasn't quite managed. In fact, hasn't managed very well at all. But there's the wonderful case that there is one word in it which starts off in Bavarian and finishes up in Anglo-Saxon. And it's a 4-letter word. It's the word Huf. It's the English word Kuf, known. And it would be the German word Hund, with a very heavy guttural in Bavarian, Hund. So you get Hund, which is a mixture of two very distinct languages. In spite of that, it's a fantastic poem.
Yeah, I think that would be Goed ist mir all Irmentheod or something like that. Is that what he
I
says?
don't
Like
remember what it is.
all nations are known to me or something like that. That is Hildebrand is saying that to his son, if
Yeah,
I'm not
yeah,
mistaken. Right. So the sort of mythological background, though, of what's going on here, if we can call it mythological, maybe just legendary, Hildebrand is fighting for Dietrich, right? If I'm not mistaken,
yes,
that would be Old English Theodrich. And both of those characters appear in the Nibelungenlied in the court of Attila the Hun. So these are really well-known characters, probably to the audience. Would
yes,
you
yes,
say
yes.
so?
Oh, yes, oh, yeah, they're well known. It's the classic distortion of history. I mean, Dietrich and Attila didn't exist at the same time. I mean, they didn't overlap. But the myth, if you like, you call it that, not really a myth. The distortion of history is that Dietrich had to flee to the court of Attila, and Hildebrand goes with him, leaving his son behind. And so much so the son thinks he is a Hun. He calls him Old Hun at one point, not his father, an old Hun, partly because the father has made the mistake of taking from his arm a gold ring, a bracelet thing, which we are told came from the Hun king, from Attila. And that identifies him. It's the worst thing he could do. And so the son has no reason to believe him, really. So,
Right. I
yes,
think it's
it's in this distorted version of history.
Yeah, I think it's a really compelling part where Hildebrand tries to sort of make the case that he is his father, and his son responds like, "You're trying to trick me," right? He says
Yeah,
like,
yeah, yeah.
You're trying to
He
get
says
out
you're
of
trying
this
to trick me.
fight."
You're a crafty old Hun. Yes.
Yeah. Wow. And then they do have to fight. And Hildebrand says beforehand, he sort of cries out to God and says, "This is, some sort of great." But the you mentioned then that it's attempted to translate into Old Saxon. It's a very strange text. There's a lot of things that are very sort of patchwork and odd about it. Could you speak at all to the meter? I think, especially coming from Old English, the meter seems very sort of extended and at times almost corrupted, but I'm not
Yes,
really sure.
you're right. There are all sorts of oddities. It's the nearest we've got to matching in Old High German to matching the great stuff in Anglo-Saxon, for example. So
Hmm.
it is theoretically in the Germanic alliterative long line, but because it's undergone such problems in being written down and it's been changed, there are lines that don't work. There are lines that don't alliterate. There are lines that are too long. There are things that have been shoved in. At one point, Hildebrand says, well, I can Waltant Gott. So he invokes God. And I suspect that's simply because it was written down in a monastery somewhere. One of the theories is that that was originally a reference to Wodan, which would alliterate nicely, but it's been changed. We just have to accept with the poem that it's not in the best shape we would like, let's say. And you're quite right. Yes, it's some of its lines don't work very well at all, which
Well,
doesn't make it easy to translate, by the way.
yeah, yeah. Was this a particularly challenging translation for you?
That was it. Wasn't the worst. In the anthology, the worst was the Georgslied, I think, probably, but that's because that's a terrible text. It was written probably by a dyslexic scribe, and you have to practically put them together. It's very, very difficult to work out. And the other one, of course, is De Henrico, which is a macaronic poem. It's got Latin and German. And I didn't quite know what to do with that as a translator to try and get rhymes in English to rhyme with bits of Latin. That's a rhyme. That's in rhyme verse. But
Right.
yes, they all have their challenges. Let's say.
A lot of the sort of rhyme schemes, you do a really great job of reflecting in the modern English translations. I thought that, I mean, I had not read much Old High German poetry, so the biggest motivating factor for me to buy the anthology and read it was that I had never really engaged with a lot of these texts before, and it was really cool to learn about them. But I found myself really, really enjoying your translations. I must say they're very well done,
Well,
and
thank you. I
your
enjoy
English
translating.
poetry is
I
quite good.
translate a lot anyway, as you know. I mean, I translated Waltharius and so on as well. And I've been translating these things for a number of years, so more than I care to remember. But there were challenges with this, and certainly when the original doesn't help by the lines being too long or not working properly, you have the choice either of tidying it up a bit, which isn't really legitimate, or doing the best you can with it.
Right, right. So the next thing on the sort of docket is the Muspilli, which I really enjoyed, but this one, if the Hildebrandslied is not really well known, no one knows what the Muspilli is. At least no one sort of in the Anglosphere really talks about it or has really heard of it before. But this one is also alliterative verse, if I'm not mistaken, right? It's the same kind of verse as the Hildebrandslied and in Old English and Old Norse, sort of. At least it shares a common ancestor.
Most of the time, it does have some rhyme lines in.
Yes, yes. Like in the Battle of Malden or a couple other Old English
Yes,
poems.
there are a couple of other models, aren't there? Yes,
Yes.
that's true.
So, but the Muspili. So, what is this poem? What's going on here?
Ah, you asked a question about translating. The translation
Yeah.
problem I had with Muspilli was how to translate the title because nobody knows what it
Yes.
means really. They chose it as the title of the 19th century because it's the one word that nobody got really. It probably means the destruction of the world, and it is a poem about the last judgment, if you like, about that there is going to come a last judgment, and it's addressed, I think, to an aristocratic audience, which is possibly why it's mostly in the old-fashioned Germanic meter. And it also talks a lot about making right judgments while you're alive. So it seems to be addressed to people who are used to making judgments. So you've got to do things properly while you're alive, because if not, you're damned. And it gives a wonderful description of what it's like to be damned with pitch and the whole lot. So, and it has sort of rather curious quasi-biblical bits in about the fight between the Antichrist and Elijah. The blood is going to fall on the earth. It's good dramatic stuff. But that one is also one that has been preserved in a very funny way, a very peculiar manner, that it was written more or less up the sides and down the middle of a rather posh manuscript, a rather fine Latin treatise, in fact. And the blank bits on the cover and around the edges has the Muspilli written around it. So that it's a poem that has to be put together, as it were, reassembled. And scholars have worked on that over the years. A man called Kolaminis did a very, very good job on it a number of years ago. So it's another one of the hazards of translating too, because you're not 100% sure what order things are in. And as I say, that one has I think probably has more rhyme lines in than the Battle of Malden, for example, but not sure why.
Yeah, the Malden poem only has about four or five, I think.
I think there's very few,
And
aren't there?
yeah, it's kind of seen as like a mark that the English language is changing towards being more rhyme friendly than alliterative friendly, but it still is, it just kind of happens every once in a while. It's still mostly an alliterative poem.
Well, that
But
particular change happens in Old High German very radically, of course,
mm,
as we only have a few things in alliterative verse. Muspelli is one, obviously, and Hildebrandslied, and the Weserbrunn creation. But suddenly after that, I haven't mentioned the name Ottfried yet, but Ottfried of Weissenburg is the looming figure who wrote a massive work, of course, as you know, in rhymed verse. And that kind of set the tone from then on in, I think. But we're not there
yeah, I
yet.
think
You're asking about Charles as well.
yeah, I think when I heard of the Nibelungenlied really early on in my studies, I had only ever read Old English at the time, and I just kind of assumed that all Germanic poetry was exactly like this sort of rigid alliterative meter. So when I first read the Nibelungenlied, I was pretty shocked. I was like, oh, what is all this rhyming doing here? And then I thought, well, it's late medieval, High German. Surely the older stuff is all alliterative. But then I get back and you read Ottfried and it's all rhyming there as well. So
Yeah.
yeah, very early on, it seems to have changed towards at
That,
least
that, that
a bit.
that's the thing I tried to make out make clear in the introduction is that Ottfried is okay. His work is what 7,000 lines. It's very long. It's okay. It's a bit dull sometimes, but it's a massive work. It was intended as a German work. It's an odd thing to say, but he's the first named author we've got, and he's the first one whose work isn't scribbled down on bits and pieces. It exists, as you know, perhaps in two or three manuscripts, 3 or 4 manuscripts, one in a different dialect even. And they're nice manuscripts. They're rubricated. They've got comments in the margin. They've been corrected by Ottfried in one case. So you've got a huge work, an intentional work that he wrote a letter apologizing for in a way, saying, I've written this in German. I hope that's all right. And he uses rhymed end rhyme, and based probably on Latin verse, where the rhymes come much more easily, of course, because of the way Latin works. But it seems like after Ottfried, it's rhyme all the way. And a lot of the other Old High German things, the smaller theological bits and pieces, the Woman of Samaria, the Psalm, they're in rhymed verse again, and rhyme establishes itself. So yes, coming to it from Old English or Old Norse, you think, good heavens, what's this? Where's all the alliterative stuff? There isn't any.
Yeah, I've
Yeah,
been
I've been.
talking a lot lately with a couple of my colleagues about sort of the changing in Germanic languages in general, how they begin with this like extremely strong initial stress. Probably Proto-Germanic has subject, object, verb,
Yeah.
sentence order, meaning that the beginning of the sentence is the most important part, and then when you get to the end of sentence, no one necessarily cares that much about what you're saying at that point. So it would make sense that the meter would want to focus on the beginning of sentences and the beginning of like clauses and stuff, and then by the time you get to about the turn of the millennium, Old High German, Old English, and a lot of Germanic languages have lost this sort of subject order, object verb, sentence order, and stuff like that. And now in popular music, in English and in German alike, it's just all rhyme. Everything rhymes. And I think it's so interesting that that happens as well at the same time as sort of Latin poetry becoming so sort of well cultivated in the northern like European countries with, Christianity coming there and really setting itself in by the turn of the millennium, because then they're wanting to imitate the Latin poetry, but it just seems to happen at the same time that they would, have this change in their own language where their own language can mimic it. And I think it's really interesting as well that you mentioned Otfried talking about sort of apologizing for writing in the vernacular, because I've been recently doing a lot of work with Alfred of Eynsham, the Old English abbot, and he
Ah,
also spends a long time sort of apologizing for writing in the vernacular and sort of having to explain himself. It's so fascinating that that also seems to be a phenomenon across all of Europe, that people are beginning to apologize for not writing in Latin.
it happens later on in Old High German as well with Notke, who only wrote prose and translated things mostly. He wrote to his bishop and said, look, I'm writing this in German. You better get used to it. It's going to happen, which I always think is quite nice, really. But Otfried was very worried about it. He worried particularly about German not being the same as Latin. He realized that the genders were different sometimes, and the things in German were not quite the same as Latin. And there were these sounds that you had to play around with to write down. And sometimes you have 3 W's together, or 3 U's rather together, so WU. And he's very apologetic about this. Although really, the bottom line is, I'm still going to do it. And he does, of course.
Right. The use. There's one word in particular that I was reading, Wewun. And in some instances, this word Wewun gets spelled Uuuun. So there's
Yes,
five U's in what would otherwise be a five-letter
yeah.
word. That is pretty
What is
ridiculous.
a double U, isn't
Yeah.
it? Or double V, I suppose, in French, but sounds
Uh-huh.
better.
So, before we move on from Muspili, though, I did want to ask, do you have like a theory about what the name means, what that word comes from?
I just go with the flow and think it is um, the destruction, the spilling, if you like, of the world,
Mm.
the getting rid of the earth is all I think
Is
it will be.
that is
The
that what
break.
it means etymologically? Etymologically?
There's been a lot of stuff on it. I wouldn't come down on one particular one. I'm
Gotcha.
certainly
There's
not going to
another.
explain that.
There's a couple weird words, and one of them is in one of the charms. It's a word that the devil can't say. Knospinky. Yeah.
Muspilli, a wonderful word. Yes, yes, I know. I'm particularly fond of that. That's in Yandum Dom contra Diablo, isn't it? Is the you put it over your door to keep devils away. I'm sure it works actually, because the devil can't say, but I don't know whether I can or not. I used to amuse my students by saying that most of the charms probably worked because they're all about minor things. They're like cuts and sprains, and they will go away eventually. But I don't guarantee the devil. You keep the devil away, put it over your door.
Right. So there's a lot of these charms. Could you maybe explain like what a charm was? Like what was the practical context in which these charms were used?
Charms are very interesting, actually, both for philologists and indeed just for literature as well. What a charm is, of course, is literally a spell, a magic utterance that is designed to make something better. Um, what it is, what it makes better, varies. Sprains, cuts, problems with horses, they apply to people and horses as well, and indeed epilepsy, epileptic fits. Now, what they are a little spell, and some of these go back a long way because some of the material that we have in Old High German even refers to the Germanic gods. There's a reference to Wodan, Freya, one of them probably to Donar, to Thor as well. But remember again, it's all been Christianized and they're all recorded in Christian documents. So they've got prayers attached to them, Christian prayers attached, which kind of legitimizes them, if you like. So they're very interesting because they do have this older material, but they've been legitimized to become what we will call collects in the Christian church. They're just prayers to make things better. As I say, they're nearly all for things that are transitory. Sprains, in the first Merseburg charm, you would perhaps say that while you're rubbing your foot or rubbing the person's foot or doing things to a horse, whatever one does, and it will go away eventually. The epilepsy ones I find very interesting. There aren't any rhymed ones. There's one, but it's very garbled and it's very difficult to work out, so I didn't put it in. But you think, well, epilepsy, how can you cure that? Well, of course you can't, because it isn't a disease anyway. It's a condition, and an epileptic fit will pass, and it will pass much better if you are soothing the patient and saying a repetitive looking charm and then a number of prayers, and it will calm them down. So that worked as well, if you like. The other ones, the other charms, are slightly different. One that I think is quite nice, and there's a parallel in Anglo-Saxon, which you'll know about, of course, is the one about bees, about the bees swarming. And that doesn't invoke Wodan and Freya, it invokes the Virgin Mary, in Bote Sancta Maria. And you don't want your bees to swarm. Whether that one worked or not, I don't know. presumably you have to do things to get bees back into the hive. But there you lose me. They were very important, though. You needed them.
Right. So my family actually do keep bees, and this was a very relatable charm for me in both the Old English version, which you mentioned, and then of course the Old High German version. Which I mean, the idea of a beekeeper running out and then seeing the swarm and invoking the Virgin Mary to return them. It's very relatable. I guess I should explain a bit. When the beehive gets full, right? Like bees constantly are reproducing, and the hive is only so big, like physically so big. So they need to clear up space. And so what they'll do is they'll create a new queen and take half of the hive and just leave.
And
And
that queen
the
will
first
take
thing
the
that they do, yeah, the first thing they do, they don't find a new hive yet. They just go and sit somewhere. So generally like a branch of a tree or something like that, they'll just go off and pile on and create like a big mass of bees there, while their scouts go out and try to find a good location for the hive. Now, what the beekeeper can do in this situation is put a decoy hive, like another empty one, down, and then hope that the scouts find that one. And the
hive
scouts say, hey,
bring them
this looks
back.
just like home. And then they all just go there instead. So, presumably, the charm would be recited in order to get them to find that one. And when it says come back, it probably means to that like empty decoy hive. So very relatable. It's a very panicked moment because it's your property, it's your sort of livelihood, and it's literally sitting on a branch of a tree deciding whether or not it's going to come back to you or not. And there's nothing you can do about it. If they don't come back, they're just gone. They leave forever. So
Yeah.
very anxious time and very interesting that they've got
Well,
this
thank
this
you.
charm for that.
That's wonderful. That's a splendid explanation. I don't
Thank you
like
very much.
the tone of it. It says, "Don't fly to the trees." Don't go to the woods.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
the lovely line, "Horror Lord Nahabastur, you haven't got a holiday." Stay where you are. It was rather nice. But of course, as you know, of course, bees were so important that the honey was a vital commodity in the period. But that's
For
lovely. I
sure.
didn't know the idea of a decoy hive is good. That probably would have got them back. Let's hope.
Usually it works, but sometimes it doesn't, and there's just nothing you can do about it. So, um, you mentioned the Merseburg charm, though. That's one that I'm really, really interested in, and I think most people are when they
Yeah.
hear that there's an Old High German charm that mentions all these gods that, for the most part, people generally associate with the Norse, right? I think the average person actually just doesn't know that Odin and Freya and Thor weren't just Norse gods, but sort of probably common throughout the entire Germanic diaspora at one point. What is this Merseburg charm, though? What is it? What is it sort of aiming at?
Now, there are two charms, two Merseburg
Hmm,
charms, first and second one.
true.
And they are very curious and very difficult because you're quite right. The first one refers to Wodan and Freya. And although remember always there's a prayer at the bottom, there's a Christian prayer at the bottom. It also refers to other people, and we have no idea who the other people are. Foll. This is the curious word, Vollender Wodan. People have done all sorts of things with it. They've tried to make it an adjective, Vollender, complete Wodan, perfect Wodan. It might be a name. It might be Paul. It might be Apollo. I've no idea. Nobody knows, let's be honest. And I've always wondered how recognizable the names were for how long. I mean, we don't recognize them in Wednesday and Thursday, obviously, but they were pretty more recognizable in this. But they've been Christianized by the prayers, so that's okay. It's very interesting, and then there must have been an earlier charm just invoking them, I suspect. What I find much more problematic is the second Merseburg charm, because the first one is about a sprain, Lidjerenki, a wrench or whatever, bone wrench, and so on. The other one tells this little story of ETC, magic women, Valkyries, whatever they are, sitting around and picking at fetters. And the punchline is escape the fetters, escape the bond. Now, there is sort of tradition in literary works of, I think, Wodan being able to help people, prisoners, to escape. I'm not sure that as a charm, this was ever intended for prisoners escaping, because they don't with a charm. I've always thought that that is another charm about cramp or sprain or something like that. And that's what you're to escape from, to escape from the bonds of, let's say, cramp. Partly because nearly all the charms are about something fairly small. Otherwise, why write it down? Obviously, it's very interesting in an antiquarian sense, because it might refer back to an actual prisoner escape charm. But in this particular context, I've always questioned why it would be written down if it isn't about something simple. However, that's an open one. No, just as open as how recognizable Wodan and Freya, and indeed these other indistinct names, were. Balder's Forlorn. I mean, there's an entire book, I think, on Balder, or a very long article anyway, by Dennis Green, about Balder, but in this particular context. But they are very difficult, and this is part of the problem with Old High German, is that it's good that we've got it, but we've got it in rather difficult circumstances, if you like, partly because of who was writing it down. And then the question is, why did they write it down? And why did they put these prayers out? They must have thought it was worth keeping. But these are not answerable questions, I don't think.
Right. I think it's really interesting to look at the sort of degrees of Christianization in some of these charms. I've recorded a couple of them on this YouTube channel, and one of them, that is the one for the nosebleeds, seems to be Christian in origin. That is, the entire charm itself is referencing Christ and John crossing the Jordan, and as the Jordan River stops, so too must the nose of nominis ilius, right? So even part of the charm itself is already in Latin. That person's blood should also stop, and then you tie a knot into their hair and say some
I'm not
prayers
in
and
the
stuff
hair,
like
that's
that.
right.
Other ones, though, like the worm disease one, where you press an arrow to the skin and then say the
Yeah.
charm, and then at the
And the
end it
worms go
says
in the
"ter
arrow.
pater noster." Yeah, you say, so you've got the whole charm, no mention of anything Christian, and at the end is written "ter pater noster." So say the Our
Yes,
Father
that's
three
right.
times. So it's almost like they've gone in and said, well, this one's not very Christian. Let's just add one thing at the end to make it Christian, and then it's all fine.
You made an interesting point too about the river, the Jordan stopping.
Mhm.
That's another aspect of these charms, in that where there are obviously Christian bits, they're quite often not biblical. They're apocryphal. My other sideline, as it were, is writing about the apocryphal literature. That is pseudepigraphic, the thing that didn't make it into the Bible. And the Jordan does stop flowing in various contexts. Sometimes, usually at Christ's baptism, and also in other things, in the Adam and Eve stories, it stops in sympathy with Adam at one point, and all the fish stand still and pray with him. However, it's useful as an idea, of course, because you want to have the river stopping and may this blood stop flowing. So you've got to have the stop flowing. But you do get apocryphal bits coming into the charms. There's one about fish being revived as well, and that crops up in an apocryphal story. So fish coming back to life. There's all kinds of oddities, but the fact that they're not actually biblical is interesting. However, it raises the question of whether people were necessarily aware of what precisely was in the Bible. Probably almost certainly not at this stage. But the hemostatic charms, the blood stopping charms, and the Jordan stopping flowing, it's quite an interesting link.
Is there a poem in the anthology that you wish was more well known, that you sort of think is underrated in that regard?
That's difficult. Yes, I think the one that I think is not well known enough and should be is Ludwigslied, the Song of Ludwig, the one about the Battle of Sokolov, because that's identifiable history. We know it was the Battle of Sokolov. We know which year it was. We know it was very important. It was really Franks defeating the Vikings on their home territory for the first time. Ironically, it didn't work because King Ludwig died not long after, so it became a memorial poem instead. But it's also, like the Hildebrandslied, it's beautifully constructed because it's a presentation of an actual historical event that we know quite a lot about, put into a theological context where you've got the theology on the outside, if you like, and the characters inside it doing what God tells them or doing what they're supposed to do, but not knowing how it's going to come out. It also has the motif of why were the Vikings sent here? Well, they were sent as a punishment because the Franks are being wicked. And it's a beautifully done poem and not very well known at all. The other interesting thing about it, of course, is that it should be in German because Louis III was king of the West Franks, so he was effectively French, and it was written in a French monastery, presumably by a German monk who was from there. So you've got a poem about a French king defeating the Vikings, written in a French monastery. The manuscript has never left France, and yet it's in German. So it's an oddity, but it's a good poem because it's very carefully put. The theology and the history are very carefully separated. And you have the sort of last lines like, Gelobet sich your Gottes Kraft, thank God's power, Ludwig war siegehaft. Historical, Ludwig was victorious. So you've got interpretation and then fact. So that's the poem I think is probably the one that I would say needs to be looked at more. I wouldn't say make the same claim about St. George, I must say, because the George poem was so difficult. But and he doesn't even have his dragon yet. So
What would you say was the most like entertaining poem to translate, or sort of the most fun to work with?
the one that I enjoyed translating most was the Hildebrandslied because everybody's had to go. I've had to go at it before. That one's a challenge because it's such a good poem. Muspilli was quite a challenge as well, so I enjoyed those. I got to despair level with the Georgslied, and I thought it was fun trying to do the De Henrico, trying to do a macaronic poem was interesting, not because I wasn't quite sure what to do with it, but no, I enjoyed translating them all. Actually, I like the idea. I like the exercise of translating, and you'll know as well that to get it into something that looks reasonable is very challenging but fun. Coming back to the beginning, my German friend said I could understand your English, but I couldn't understand that the other stuff was German even.
Right. Yeah, I think for the when you say it aloud, I think it makes it a lot more understandable. I have in one of my videos, the whole video is in German, and so it attracted a much more German audience, and most of them said that when they read it without the sound, they couldn't really understand it, but when they heard it pronounced, then it was like totally understandable to
Yeah,
them, which makes a
yeah.
lot of
I
sense. I
don't
think
know
that's
how
also true.
accurate one's pronunciation is, of course, of this stuff, but I used to have to with my students. My students used to back in the day would get me to read it out, and they said the same sort of thing. They said, "Yeah, it looks weird, but it does sound more like German when you say it." Presumably because you assimilate a little, I suppose. To you stress the right, you stress the stressed vowel, and the others, by definition, don't get stressed as much.
Right. I do have to catch myself sometimes because my German is not that good. And so I concentrate a lot when I'm speaking in German and reading German. And so I accidentally sometimes apply the same concentration to Old High German. And so I'll voice the S at the beginning when it probably wasn't voiced in Old High German, just because it's like it looks German to me, and so I'm trying, and I just, I relegate it to the same part of my brain. So there are probably slips like that, which do make it sound more like modern German. But in general, I think it's the same as Middle English. When you look at Middle English, a lot of people just totally don't know what they're looking at. But when you read Chaucer, for example, a lot of people can actually just understand what you're saying, even just auditorily, because it's so, it makes it a lot more understandable, I think.
Oh yeah, yeah. And it's good to read the stuff out anyway, I think, in Middle High German as well. And in fact, it's rather sad that we don't have enough singable tunes for Minnesang, which is it was the pop music of the day, so at least pop music for the aristocracy, I suppose. But it was certainly popular music. I used to do a lot of comparing Minnesang with modern, not in your sense, modern in my sense, pop music, the Beatles. You won't remember the Beatles, it was a long time ago. But there were a lot of parallels with Minnesang.
I see. Yeah, I don't remember the Beatles. No.
Before your time, dear boy.
Well,
Sorry.
folks, the Old High German anthology is out. I'll have the link to that in the description. Before we end on time, I do want to talk a bit about the Waltharius, because that's another work that was very personally interesting. When Uppsala Books came out with your edition of the Waltharius, I had never heard of it before, much less read it. Another one of those situations where it's like it's such an interesting, and it should be a more important text. But I think because of the fact that it wasn't composed in England or in English, most Anglophone speakers have just never even heard of it. But I think it's one of the greater sort of epics of the medieval tradition. Could you talk a bit about the Waltharius and sort of what it is?
I mean, I concur with what you said. It is one of the most interesting ones, and of course, the characters in it are ones that are familiar from other works, and yet Waltharius himself is a one-off character. He's a Germanic hero that is not otherwise known, except of course he is. He turns up not only in the Waltharius story. There are lots of other medieval references to him. And at the moment, I'm translating the Song of Roland, the Chanson de Roland, and he turns up in that. He must be about 600 years old by then, but anyway, he's still fighting. So somebody who starts off as a probably a Visigoth king and finishes up fighting for Charlemagne really is a more important character than one thinks. It's a good story, Waltharius, the Latin version. I translated it because I knew about it, and I was teaching the Germanic hero, and there wasn't a translation of it that was easily accessible. And so I did a version for my students, which was then reprinted in Uppsala Books, revised slightly, and done that. And London Nightoff did the edition to go with it. Yes, a very interesting work, and a lot still to be done on it, I think. I know people are working on it quite a bit. I'm no longer retired, so I'm not working on it particularly at the moment. But I've got enough to do. Please, how do I stop? But there is a lot still to be said about Waltharius. As I say, I'm looking at him in the Song of Roland, and he shouldn't be there at all. He should have been dead by at least 400 years, even if it was at the court of the Huns, which he wasn't, because that was after his time anyway. But Walter del Hum, Walter of the Huns, suddenly appears as one of the main characters at Roncesvalles, an oddity. So he's obviously a much better known Germanic figure than we think. Part of the problem, of course, is that we've got Waltharius, of which the author apologized, of course, at the end for this being a bit of a young man's work. But we don't have the Middle High German Walther and Hildegard. We've only got a few odd fragments of the real one, which is a pity. He crops up in all the Dietrich epics, of course. Not, I have to say, terribly exciting passages. They're just, he is a very good warrior. We know that. but the complexities of the Hildegund and Hagen relationships in Waltharius, you're right, need a lot more looking at.
Yeah, I was recently reading a book that treats with sort of medieval or just, old epics to follow the sort of relationship between the king and the hero. And in that book, there are a couple epics that are taken as like the ones that we should look at. And those are like the Odyssey, the Aeneid, I think the Iliad as well. And then like Beowulf, the Nibelungenlied, Elfheid, the Song of Roland, of course, and then the Waltharius, right? And it's like all of the other six ones are very well known, talked about sort of like national epics, but the Waltharius, I think, gets left out a lot. I think, and it's really interesting. You mentioned it's part of this sort of mythological framework that we have in the Nibelungenlied, and Gunther is one of the main characters, right? Hagen, who betrays Siegfried in the Nibelungenlied, is also one of the main characters here, I think, in a more positive light. And then Walther, who also is in an Old English fragment, and
Yes, it goes
that
around,
one
yeah.
also not very gripping stuff. I really wish we had the
No,
whole text.
exactly.
But so what happens though in the Waltharius? What is the story that we're told here?
Well, this is the story of the three hostages, uh, Walter and Hildegunde and Hagen, finishing up as hostages at the court of the Huns, and Hagen escaping, leaving. Hagen, I'll come back to Hagen. Hagen's probably the most interesting character, in fact, in many of these works. And I'll pick up on something in a moment. And then, when he's gone, Walter and Hildegund decide they will also leave by the simple process of getting the Huns thoroughly drunk, taking all their money and clearing off. It's a little unheroic in some senses, but this wonderful scene of the drunken Huns and Attila with a hangover the following morning, saying, where's Waltharius gone, this kind of thing. They then make it back, and of course Waltharius has to fight with Hagen when he gets back, because of the tribute, because of money and so on. And it's sorted out. One of the reasons that the work is probably not so well known is that the ending is a bit odd. This fight between the various people, leaving them all somewhat impaired with limbs missing and bits cut off. And then the church comes in and kind of stops the fight and says, that's enough, now we'll have a reconciliation. That's possibly why it's not as well known as it perhaps should be. But yes, Hagen, come back to Hagen. Hagen, you said Hagen betrays Siegfried in the Nibelungenlied. Yes, I wonder whether, yes, he does, of course, but whether he's not the one who's really trying to save the court from this dreadful interloper Siegfried, or Siegfried. I think is probably something that I used to try and belabor a bit when I was teaching this kind of thing, that Hagen, it's easy to vilify Hagen, but he is, after all, not the interloper, not the disruptive factor. Siegfried is a nuisance, he's a pain. And one of the things that interests me about heroic literature, you probably come across this as well, is that the great heroes are, the ones who are presented as great heroes, are sometimes liabilities. Roland is the same. Roland is the great national hero, of course, but he's still an arrogant, I can beat these people on my own. No, I'm not going to sound my horn and bring back the Frankish cavalry. So he's ambiguous. Siegfried is very ambiguous, and Hagen, I think, is not to be vilified as much. He's ambiguous in Waltharius as well, of course, because he's still the friend of Waltharius, of Walter, but has to do as he's told from Gunther with Ari. So all these things are interesting. I find the hero you mentioned the book, was that the hero and the king? Was that the
Yes. Yeah, it's a great read.
excellent book. Very good, very, very interesting book. The tensions and the position of the hero is a very tricky one always. Lots to be said, and that's one reason I think why I'm quite keen to get some of these things out and for people to look at and consider the hero, and for example, in as many contexts as they can.
Yeah, I think it's interesting you mentioned the sort of danger of having this diva hero in the court, because the book mentions Beowulf as being sort of a threat in that regard. Not necessarily the same problem as Roland and Walter, but a sort of threat that Walther, the queen, Hrothgar's queen, warns him about, and says, why did you say that this guy was going to be the heir of the throne? Let's let's just get him out of here. He has won these great victories, but let's wave him goodbye so that he stops sort of bothering us and doesn't turn into the same problem that you get with Siegfried, which I suppose is a pretty good explanation of why Hagen has to kill him, for the same reason that Walchtheo wanted to get Beowulf sort of far away, in that he's an interloper. He sort of messes with the order that has been set up in things like succession and which hero is supposed to get praised by the king and rewarded and stuff like that. So the Waltharius then also recently came out. I'll have the link to that in the description for anyone who's interested in that. Real quick before we go, could you sort of tell us a bit about how you got into this stuff, how you became so well educated in this area of philology and medieval languages?
It goes way back. I mean, way back to school. I thought about this actually. I think I encountered Chaucer at school. We did Chaucer as part of the advanced level English course when I was at school. And I liked this, and I remember very distinctly going, in those days you had to be interviewed to get into university. And I went to Exeter University in the south of England. And the professor there was a very eminent Schiller scholar, a classical period scholar. And he asked me, I didn't know this, and he asked me what I was interested in. And I said, well, I really like Chaucer. Is there anything in German like this? And he was very sniffy and said, yes, you will find some. He wasn't remotely interested, but he was very kind in the end. And I was lucky in a way in that I had a tutor as an undergraduate, a woman called Hilda Swinburne, who passed away only a few years ago at the age of 102, who was an Old High German specialist. And she was very interested in Ottfried. And she put on a course on Old High German, and I got interested in Old High German then. Then, after I left Exeter, I went to Cambridge and I did my doctorate on, not on Old High German, but on very early New High German, very early modern, get it right in a minute, very early Middle High German, right on the turning point, 11th century, 12th century stuff, mostly on Genesis, actually, on the Adam and Eve story. And I've kept that interest. When I began teaching, the first job I got, curiously at the University of Glasgow, they wanted someone to teach Old High German and 19th century German. So I was about the only candidate that could offer the 9th and the 19th as an interest. And so I've done it ever since. And I was lucky I was able to continue teaching Old High German for most of my career. It's not largely taught these days in Britain. Oxford, query Cambridge. Not sure about Cambridge because the colleague there has just retired. Medieval studies and indeed German is not taught widely in British universities anymore, which is sad. But that was my background. It's always been interested in the Middle Ages, I think, is the answer, and lucky to be directed towards Old High German at a very early stage. It was just slightly odd, interesting. There was good stuff there, and I didn't quite take the philological route completely. I was more interested in the literary aspects, and with Middle High German as well. But I think I managed to keep it alive more or less. But then, as I say, I retired 20 years ago. So
Well, I think I speak for many young scholars when I say that we are very lucky to have had you in the field and still have you in the field. So, Brian Murdoch, thank you very much for coming on the channel.
you're very welcome. Lovely to see you.